The silence was the first weapon. Before the railgun spun up, before the shields shimmered to life, before the first drop of blood was shed in the cold vacuum, there was only a profound and terrifying silence. It fell across the galaxy not like a blanket, but like a blade, severing the trillion threads of light and data that bound the Thek hegemony together on Varuna, a crystalline world where the Thek nobility swam in atmospheric seas of shimmering gas. The market tickers went blank, sparking a panic that vaporized fortunes in minutes. In the shipyards of the insectoid Cathar, automated assembly lines ground to a halt, their logic cores suddenly starved of instruction. On 10,000 worlds, fleets lost contact with their command, governors with their capitals, and families with their loved ones across the stars. The Nexus, the faster-than-light communications network that was the hegemony's central nervous system, its greatest triumph and its most unthinking vulnerability, was gone. It hadn't just been jammed. It was as if the very concept of it had been erased from the universe by an invisible, unknowable hand. In the grand halls of power, the initial confusion curdled into a primal fear they had not felt in a millennium. They were blind, deaf, and alone. Adrift in the empire they thought they ruled. It was in that deafening silence that humanity began to scream. Admiral Kalen Vance felt the silence not in his ears, but in the marrow of his old bones. He stood on the bridge of the T.S., so steadfast, the flagship of the Sol Defense Fleet, and watched the star chart go dark. The blinking runes that represented Nexus relays across the Orion Arm winked out one by one, like dying embers. His bridge crew, young and conditioned to the yoke of the hegemony, looked around in confusion, their faces pale in the glow of dead monitors. They were the children of the Compact, the humiliating treaty signed a century ago that had confined humanity to its home system, stripped it of its advanced technology, and reduced it to a client species, a source of cheap labor and cheaper raw materials for the grander races of the galaxy. The Steadfast itself was a monument to that humiliation, a lumbering, obsolete dreadnought with weapon systems 100 years out of date and armor that wouldn't stop a well-aimed rock. It was a scarecrow, a hollow gesture of sovereignty permitted by the hegemony to keep the primitives of Earth content. Vance had commanded this pathetic fleet for 30 years, bowing to Cathar overseers, smiling through gritted teeth as Thek ambassadors toured his ship with undisguised contempt. He had played the part of the beaten old man, the loyal servant of the new order, and he had played it perfectly. Admiral, his communications officer, a boy barely out of his teens, stammered, "We've lost everything. The Sol Relay, the Proxima Relay, all of them. It's a total network collapse." Vance turned slowly, his face a mask of weary lines and practiced patience. He let the boy's panic hang in the air, a final, lingering echo of the old world. "Is it, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly thing, devoid of the surprise his crew expected. He looked at each of them, at their frightened, confused faces, the faces of a people who had forgotten what it was to have teeth. For 50 years, he and a handful of others had nurtured a secret, a seed of defiance planted in the barren soil of their defeat. They had watched humanity toil in hegemony mines on Titan, process ores in the toxic clouds of Venus, and die in border skirmishes the hegemony deemed beneath its notice. They had swallowed their pride, but they had never digested their hate. And in the darkness, in the forgotten corners of their own system, they had been building. "Commander Rostova," Vance said, his voice now carrying a new authority, a sharp, cold edge that made the crew flinch. "Report." From the tactical station, a woman with pale eyes and hair the color of spun silver looked up. Commander Eva Rostova was his prodigy, a genius of stealth warfare and strategic analysis, her brilliance carefully hidden behind a record of unremarkable service. She alone on this bridge knew what was coming. A faint, grim smile touched her lips. "The virus has achieved 100% propagation. Admiral, the entire Nexus is a brick. Predictive models show it will take the hegemony a minimum of 3 standard weeks to establish even rudimentary point-to-point laser comms between their core worlds. They are system-locked, blind and deaf, just as planned." Vance nodded, a single, sharp gesture. "Initiate Phase 2. Unveil the board." Rostova's fingers danced across her console. A new command protocol, buried for decades under layers of mundane code, came to life. The main view screen of the Steadfast flickered, the dead map of the hegemony vanishing. In its place, a new map bloomed. It showed the Sol system, but not as the hegemony knew it. Thousands of new icons flared into existence in the Oort cloud, the vast, dark shell of icy bodies at the system's edge. They were ships, not the rust buckets of the Sol defense fleet, but sleek, angular predators of matte black alloy, their signatures previously hidden by a web of cloaking fields and false sensor readings generated from hollowed-out comets. This was the Ghost Fleet, the true Terran Navy, built piece by piece, in secret shipyards burrowed deep into asteroids, funded by a century of skimmed resources and black market deals, crewed by the children of those who had never forgotten what it meant to be free. A collective gasp swept the bridge. The young lieutenant who had reported the collapse now stared, his mouth agape, at the impossible truth on the screen. The Scarecrow fleet he served on was a lie. The defeated old admiral was a phantom. Humanity was not a beaten dog. It was a coiled serpent. "My God," the lieutenant whispered. "They never knew." Vance's gaze was fixed on the tactical display. "They knew we were primitives," he said, his voice laced with the ice of a long-nurtured vengeance. "They believed we were too emotional, too fractured, too stupid to ever challenge them. Their arrogance was the foundation upon which we built our entire strategy." He turned to Rostova. "Your task force is green-lit. You have your targets." Eva Rostova nodded, her expression hardening into professional resolve. "Strike Wing Obsidian is ready. We will make them bleed, sir." She stood, saluted crisply, and walked off the bridge, her boots echoing with a purpose that had been denied to her people for a century. She was the tip of the spear, the first blade to be thrust into the hegemony's soft, unsuspecting underbelly. Her fleet, the fastest and stealthiest ships humanity had ever conceived, would not be engaging Cathar warships or Thek battlecruisers. Vance's opening gambit was far more cruel and far more effective. The war for humanity's soul would not begin with a battle. It would begin with an audit. Rostova's target was the Cerberus Gateway, a trio of massive, privately owned refinery stations orbiting a gas giant in a neutral, unpoliced system. The Cerberus stations weren't military targets. They were the linchpin of the entire sector's economy. They refined the exotic gases needed for high-grade ship fuel, processed the alloys for hegemony construction projects, and served as a major financial clearinghouse for a dozen lesser species, It was a civilian target, teeming with workers, traders, and their families. It was also utterly undefended, its security consisting of a few lightly armed patrol cutters, a testament to the placid peace the hegemony's power had enforced. It was the perfect place to demonstrate the new rules of war. Rostova's ship, the Nyx, a blade-like stealth frigate, slipped into the system like a ghost. Her small fleet of 6 ships decloaked less than 1,000 kilometers from the first station, Cerberus Alpha. They didn't broadcast warnings or demands. There was no declaration of war. War had been declared 100 years ago when the first hegemony boot had touched Martian soil. This was merely the overdue reply. Target their fuel reserves, their primary reactors, and their docking spines, Rostova ordered from the command chair of the Nyx, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her heart. Disable. Do not destroy. We want them crippled, not martyred. Fire. The Nyx and its sister ships fired, not with explosive torpedoes or devastating energy beams, but with precision kinetic slugs and surgical EMP lances. The tungsten rods, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, punched clean holes through the massive fuel tanks of Cerberus Alpha, cryogenic fuel, worth more than the GDP of a dozen worlds, vented into space in a brilliant, silent plume of freezing gas. EMP pulses slammed into the station's unshielded reactor core, causing a catastrophic shutdown that plunged the sprawling structure into darkness and chaos. The docking arms, which connected dozens of freighters and transports to the station, were severed by precise kinetic strikes, sending the ships tumbling helplessly into the void. Panic erupted across the station's internal comms, a chaotic symphony of alien screams and terrified shouts that Rostova's sensors picked up with chilling clarity. She watched the life pod signatures bloom like spores as the station's population tried to flee. She had given her gunnery officers strict orders to ignore them. This wasn't about slaughter. It was about strangulation. Within an hour, all 3 Cerberus stations were inert, burning hulks. The sector's economy had just been decapitated. Billions in assets were gone. Supply chains were shattered. And no one knew who had done it. Rostova's fleet, their grim work complete, simply vanished back into the void, leaving behind a scene of economic devastation that would send shockwaves through the hegemony. If only they could tell anyone about it. Aboard the Nyx, Rostova watched the burning station recede on her view screen. A crew member let out a quiet cheer, a sentiment echoed by others. They had struck the first blow for a free humanity. But Eva Rostova felt no elation. She felt only the cold, heavy weight of the screams she had heard, the lives she had ruined. She looked at the reflection of her own face in the darkened screen, and, for a terrifying moment, she saw the same cold, ruthless certainty that she saw in Admiral Vance's eyes. They had lit a fire in the heart of the galaxy, a fire of liberation, but she could not shake the feeling that its flames would burn them all. Back in the Sol system, Admiral Vance watched the reports pour in, not just from Rostova, but from a dozen other strike wings of the Ghost Fleet. In the Orphos Cloud, a vital hegemony mining operation was crippled, its asteroid crackers disabled, its ore haulers set adrift. At the Xylan Trade Nexus, a logic bomb wiped the financial data of the entire sector, erasing debts and assets alike, sowing pure economic chaos. Each strike was a pinprick, but they were precise, coordinated, and aimed at the hegemony's true source of power, its wealth and its stability. The great warships of the Cathar sat idle in their docks, their fanatical crews useless, for their enemy did not offer battle. The Thek fleets drifted aimlessly, their aristocratic commanders unable to receive orders. The hegemony was a giant, paralyzed by 1,000 tiny cuts. Vance allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The first phase, the disruption, was a success. He had plunged the galaxy into the dark. Now, humanity would teach them what it was like to fear it. He looked out at the silent stars, no longer a prisoner in his own home, but a king in a fortress of his own making. The silence would not last forever. He knew the hegemony would recover. They would rebuild their networks. And when they did, their rage would be absolute, their retribution biblical. They would come for Saul, not with a fleet, but with an armada of annihilation. Let them come, he thought, a cold fire burning in his weary eyes. We've been waiting. The quiet war was over. The real war was just beginning. For 3 standard days, the Thek hegemony was an empire of ghosts. On the Cathar hive world of Cathar Prime, a planet of geometric canyons and eusocial order, Hive Marshal Zelar felt the silence as a physical corruption of the natural law. The Cathar were a species of perfect connection, their society a single, telepathically linked organism where every drone knew its function in service to the whole. The Nexus had been an artificial, but acceptable, extension of that whole, a tool that brought the lesser species into their rigid order. Its absence was a blasphemy, a severing of the great chain. Zylar, whose chiseled black carapace bore the ritual scars of 1,000 campaigns, stood immobile on the command dais of his flagship, the carapace of worlds. His multifaceted eyes, pits of obsidian fury, stared at a tactical display that showed nothing but the cold, isolated reality of his own star system. Reports, when they finally arrived via lumbering courier drones, were fragmented, chaotic, and infuriating. Financial hubs erased, refineries crippled, mining colonies gone dark. Not a single report spoke of a fleet engagement, of an honorable clash of arms. This was not war. It was vermin gnawing at the foundations of a temple. They strike at fuel and data, his sub-commander rasped, its mandibles clicking in agitation. They avoid our fleets. It is the tactic of cowards. Zelar did not move, but a low thrumming vibrated through the deck plates beneath his feet, the Cathar equivalent of a growl. Cowardice was a concept as alien to him as mercy. He saw only a failure to comprehend the true nature of power. Power was not held in currency or commerce. It was held in the unbreakable hulls of warships and the righteous fire of plasma cannons. This enemy, whoever it was, had forgotten that lesson, or perhaps had never been taught it properly. The evidence, thin as it was, pointed to a single source. The disruptions had a temporal epicenter, a point of origin from which the plague of silence had spread. That point was the Sol system, the primitives, the Terrans, the soft, chaotic mammals they had penned up a century ago. It was illogical, impossible, and yet it was the only conclusion that fit the facts. They are a pestilent species, Zelar finally grated, his voice like stone grinding on stone. And pests must be purged with fire, not reasoned with. Our orders from the Hegemony Command are to hold position. Marshal, the sub-commander cautioned, until the Nexus is restored, Zelar turned his massive head, the gesture silencing the officer instantly. Hegemony Command is silent. The chain is broken. In the absence of the whole, the strongest part acts for the whole. That is the law. He raised one pincer-like hand and slammed it down on the activation rune for his local fleet command. Assemble the 9th Extermination Fleet. We are no longer holding position. We are going hunting. We will make a series of short-range jumps. It will be slow. It will be inefficient, but it will get us to their filthy mud ball of a homeworld. And when we arrive, we will crack it open and salt the pieces with the ashes of their cities. There was no cheer, no cry of support from his bridge crew. There was only the silent, perfect, and terrifying unity of purpose. The 9th Fleet, a force of 40 battle-hardened Cathar cruisers and destroyers, began to stir from its docks, a swarm of vengeance rousing from its hive. They did not care about the hegemony's economy. They cared only for the restoration of order, and order would be restored with the sharp, clean finality of extinction. Aboard the T, Seis, Nix. The silence was of a different kind. It was the heavy, contemplative quiet that follows an act of profound and irreversible violence. Commander Eva Rostova sat in her ready room, the after-action report from the Cerberus strike glowing on a data slate in her hands. The numbers were clean, sterile, infrastructure damage 94%, economic impact catastrophic, hegemony military casualties 0. But she had cross-referenced the station's public census data, acquired years ago by Terran intelligence, estimated civilian casualties from secondary explosions, atmospheric failure, and botched evacuations over 70,000 souls. They were Thek, Cathar, and a dozen other species, engineers, merchants, pilots, their children. 70,000 ghosts now haunted her victory. Her crew saw her as a hero, the Reaper of Cerberus, the woman who had dealt the first great blow. They celebrated in the mess hall, their cheers echoing faintly through the bulkheads. But Rostova felt only the icy grip of what she had unleashed. She believed in Vance's cause, in a free humanity. But she had never imagined freedom would be purchased with the lives of so many non-combatants. She wondered if the Admiral, in his cold calculus of war, even registered them as a cost. A chime at her door broke her reverie. Enter. It was her tactical officer, Lieutenant Jax, a young man whose face was still flush with the thrill of their success. Ma'am, new orders from Fleet Command. We have a new target. He placed another data slate on her desk. Rostova picked it up. The target was an agro-world in the Pavo sector, a planet wholly dedicated to cultivating the nutrient-rich fungi that fed the hegemony's elite Thek caste. It was another civilian target, another artery to be severed. Our mission is to cripple their atmospheric processors and orbital distribution hubs. Jax explained eagerly. Another clean cut. We'll starve the bastards out. Rostova looked from the slate to the young officer's bright, zealous eyes. She saw in him the same fire that Vance had ignited in them all, a righteous flame that threatened to burn away their humanity in its quest to reclaim it. There is no such thing as a clean cut. Lieutenant, she said, her voice quiet but firm. There is only the wound and the bleeding. Prepare the fleet for transit. I'll be on the bridge in 5. Meanwhile, Admiral Vance was orchestrating the next phase of his grand design. Phase 3 was codenamed Fracture, and its architect was not a soldier, but a whisper merchant named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man who looked utterly out of place on the Spartan bridge of the Steadfast. dressed in a tailored civilian suit, his demeanor more that of a corporate predator than a revolutionary. His weapons were not torpedoes, but information. The hegemony is not a monolith, Admiral Thorne explained, gesturing to a complex social and political map of the galaxy. It's a pyramid scheme. The Thek and the Cathar sit at the top, and everyone else pays tribute. For every species that benefits, there are 10 that suffer under their yoke. His plan was simple and insidious. With the Nexus down, he was using a network of deep space probes to launch data ghosts, highly compressed, encrypted packets of information at the comm relays of these subjugated species. The packets contained everything from hegemony financial exploitation records and evidence of engineered famines to, most importantly, the complete technical schematics for humanity's new generation of cloaking devices and gravitic drives. We're not just showing them their chains. Admiral, Thorne said with a thin, predatory smile, we're handing them the bolt cutters. When the hegemony finally gets its eyes and ears back, it won't just be dealing with us. It will be dealing with a dozen nascent rebellions, all armed with our technology. We're not just starting a war. We're starting a galactic plague of independence. Vance listened, his expression unreadable. He was a master of strategy, and he understood the brutal elegance of Thorne's logic. Forcing the hegemony to fight a multi-front war against enemies it couldn't track would bleed its resources and shatter its political unity. It was a masterstroke, a way to turn the hegemony's own oppressive weight against itself. It was also a move that would plunge countless worlds into bloody civil wars, unleashing chaos on a scale even he found daunting. But he had crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back. Proceed. Mr. Thorne, Vance ordered. Unleash your plague. It was on their way to the Pavo sector that the universe threw a wrench into Vance's meticulous clockwork. The Nyx, running under silent, passive sensor protocols, skirted the edge of a dense nebula. Roistova was on the bridge, the weight of her new mission settling upon her, when her sensor chief suddenly stiffened. Ma'am, I'm getting something faint, but it's there. On the main screen, a string of ghost-like signatures appeared. They were not using Nexus-linked FTL drives, which would have been screamingly obvious. Instead, they were executing a series of coordinated, short-range spatial displacements. A brutish, inefficient way of traveling that no sane fleet would use unless it had no other choice. There were dozens of them, their drive signatures heavy, overlapping, and distinctly Cathar. They were moving in a tight, disciplined formation, a wolf pack on the hunt, and their trajectory was chillingly, undeniably clear. Plot their projected course, Rostova commanded, her voice sharp as glass. The computer traced a crimson line across the star chart. It bisected asteroid fields and bypassed trade lanes. A straight, unswerving spear aimed at a single, tiny yellow star in the distance. Sol. The blood drained from Rostova's face. The quiet war, the war of 1,000 cuts, was over before it had truly begun. The hegemony wasn't waiting to fix its network. It wasn't trying to understand their strategy. A wounded, enraged beast was simply charging straight for their throat. Get me a secure channel to Admiral Vance, she snapped, her earlier moral quandaries vaporized by the imminent, existential threat. Tell him the swarm is coming. On the bridge of the Steadfast, Vance received the message. The icons of the Cathar Ninth Fleet populated his tactical display, a tide of crimson death rolling unstoppably toward his home. Elias Thorne, the man of whispers and schemes, fell silent, his political machinations suddenly seeming trivial in the face of such raw, kinetic fury. All of Vance's plans, his careful deconstruction of the hegemony's power, had been predicated on time. Time he had just run out of. He looked at the approaching fleet, then at the icons of his own ghost fleet, scattered across the sector on their missions of sabotage. He had designed them as scalpels. Now, he had to use them as a shield against a sledgehammer that was about to fall. The old admiral's face, a mask of cold calculation for so long, settled into a grim, hard line. The serpent had been poked. Now it would have to strike. The news of the Ninth Fleet's approach hit the bridge of the Steadfast like a kinetic slug. The quiet confidence of Admiral Vance's command center evaporated, replaced by a stark, cold dread. The crew, who moments before had seen themselves as the architects of a brilliant new galactic order, now saw themselves as they truly were, the last, desperate line of defense for a species on the brink of annihilation. Elias Thorne's complex webs of political intrigue and economic sabotage seemed like children's games in the face of the 40 crimson icons crawling across the main display. Hive Marshal Zyler was not coming to negotiate, to sanction, or to posture. He was coming to erase a mistake from the galactic map. Vance stood before the tactical plot, his face carved from granite. The century of patience, the decades of planning, the sheer, audacious gamble of plunging the galaxy into darkness, all of it had culminated in this. A race against time he was destined to lose. "Recall the fleet," he said, his voice a low command that cut through the rising panic. "All strike wings, all task forces, disengage from disruption and fracture protocols. Your new orders are simple: come home. Defend Sol." The command went out. A ripple of desperation spreading through the Ghost Fleet. Ships that were moments from crippling hegemony assets aborted their runs and turned back, their gravitic drives straining as they began the long journey home. But home was too far away. The map told the story. The Cathar were a force in being, a concentrated spear point. The Terran fleet was a fine mist scattered across 100 light-years. By the time they could form a coherent battle line in front of Earth, the Ninth Fleet would have already turned it into a cinder. "They will not make it in time," Commander Rostova's voice stated, cutting through the secure channel from the Nix. It was not a question. It was a eulogy. Vance zoomed the tactical display in on her position. Her small task force, Strike Wing Obsidian, was a lonely cluster of blue icons directly in the path of the Cathar advance. "No." "Commander," Vance replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the order he was about to give. "They will not. Which means you must buy them the time they need." A silence stretched across the comm link, a void thick with unspoken understanding. Rostova was being asked to throw her ship and the lives of her crew into the gears of the Cathar war machine, to slow it down, to bleed it, even if it cost her everything. "We need a battlefield of our own choosing," Rostova said, her voice betraying no fear, only a cold, analytical focus. "There is a stellar remnant cluster ahead of the Ninth Fleet's path. The Typhon's Veil. It's a cosmic boneyard, debris from a supernova eons ago, thick with metallic asteroids, rogue planetoids, and high levels of electromagnetic interference. A perfect place for ghosts to hunt." Vance looked at the veil on his map. It was a chaotic smear of radiation and gravitic anomalies, a nightmare for navigation and long-range sensors, for a fleet of stealth ships, It was the only advantage they could hope for. "You will not engage them head-on," Commander Vance instructed, his tone that of a master instructing his final student. "You are not a shield. You are a razor. Bleed them. Cripple their lead ships. Damage their drive systems. Sow chaos in their vanguard. Make them pay for every light year in blood and steel. We will route every available ship to reinforce you, but for the next 48 hours, you are the only thing standing between that swarm and our home." Rostova's face, projected on a secondary screen, was pale but resolute. "We understand the mission. Admiral, we will be the Razor. Obsidian Wing, out." The Typhon's veil was even more treacherous than the charts had suggested. Shards of crystalline structures the size of moons tumbled through clouds of ionized gas, their surfaces scarred by millennia of micrometeoroid impacts. The Nyx and its 5 sister ships navigated the lethal maze, their hulls running cold, their emissions reduced to a whisper. On the bridge, Eva Rostova felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. The moral ambiguity of attacking civilian targets was gone, burned away by the singular, righteous purpose of survival. Her crew, their earlier celebratory mood replaced by a grim determination, worked in near silence, their movements precise and economical. They were no longer saboteurs. They were protectors. "They're entering the Veil," Lieutenant Jax reported, his voice tense. On the tactical display, the Cathar fleet pushed into the nebula, their formation tight and arrogant. They were a sledgehammer, and they did not fear the darkness. They intended to smash their way through it. Hive Marshal Xylar stood on the carapace of worlds, his multifaceted eyes scanning the sensor readings. The Veil was an annoyance, a disruption to his fleet's perfect, orderly advance. But nothing more. Increase sensor gain. Active sweeps on all forward-facing arrays. He commanded. "These primitives may think they can hide in this dust cloud. We will light it up like a nova." Massive energy pulses began to flood the nebula, a brute force attempt to burn through any stealth technology. It was a predictable, arrogant tactic, and Rostova was ready for it. "They're painting us," Jax murmured. "They just haven't found us yet." Rostova's eyes were fixed on the lead Cathar cruiser, the unyielding Claw. "Patience, Lieutenant," she whispered. She waited, letting the Cathar advance deeper, letting their active scans create a cacophony of sensor ghosts and false readings within the veil. She was waiting for the perfect moment. It came when the unyielding Claw passed behind a massive, slowly rotating iron asteroid. "All ships," Rustova commanded, her voice sharp and clear. "Target the Claw's primary drive assembly. Fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark, from the shadows of the debris field, 6 Terran stealth frigates decloaked simultaneously. For a single, breathtaking second, they were exposed, their sleek black forms silhouetted against the swirling nebular gas. Then they fired, hypervelocity tungsten slugs, invisible to the naked eye, crossed the void in a heartbeat. They struck the Cathar cruiser, not on its heavily armored prow, but on its vulnerable stern. The slugs, designed for surgical strikes, punched through the thinner armor plating surrounding the drive cones. There was no grand explosion, no Hollywood fireball. Instead, the unyielding Claw simply stopped. Its massive engines sputtered and died, coolant venting in a silent, expanding cloud of ice crystals. The ship, a behemoth of war, was now a dead, drifting hulk. its momentum carrying it forward into its own fleet's path. Before the Cathar could even process what had happened, the 6 Terran ships had vanished, their cloaking fields re-engaged, melting back into the electromagnetic chaos of the Veil. On the bridge of the Carapace of Worlds, confusion reigned. One moment, the unyielding claw was leading the charge. The next, it was a dead thing, causing 2 destroyers behind it to make emergency maneuvers to avoid a collision. "Report," Xylar bellowed. Where did the attack come from? The sensor officer's mandibles clicked in frustration. The energy signature was minimal, martial, like a rock hitting the hull. But the damage, it's critical. The claw is disabled. Xylar's rage was a palpable force. They were being toyed with, hunted. Reroute power to forward particle screens. All ships, prepare for point defense saturation fire. But as they prepared, another Terran strike came from a different vector. This time, the target was a destroyer, the Hunter's Mandible, its dorsal communications array. The hard point for its short-range command and control functions was sheared clean off by another volley of kinetic slugs. The ship was not disabled, but it was now deaf and dumb to its commander's orders. In the span of 20 minutes, Rostova's 6 ships had crippled 2 Cathar warships without taking a single point of damage. They were bleeding the swarm, one ship at a time. The battle for the Veil became a lethal game of cat and mouse. Rostova's ships would appear, strike, and vanish, using the debris as both cover and concealment. They never attacked the same way twice. They disabled weapon emplacements, targeted sensor masts, and crippled drive systems. They turned the Cathar's greatest strength, their numbers and rigid formation, into a weakness. The fleet, designed for overwhelming frontal assault, could not cope with an enemy that refused to fight on its terms. Xylar, a master of fleet-scale warfare, was being driven to madness by a handful of gnats he could not swat. He ordered his ships to fire indiscriminately into the dust clouds, hoping to hit something, anything. Vast swaths of the nebula were sterilized by plasma fire, but the Ghost Fleet was never where the fire was. They were always somewhere else, their next attack already planned. But the gnats had teeth, and the swarm was learning. Xylar, in a stroke of brutal tactical genius, changed his formation. He broke his fleet into smaller, independent hunter-killer packs of 3, spreading them out to create an overlapping web of sensor coverage that was much harder to avoid. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. The Nyx was lining up a shot on a Cathar cruiser when Jax's voice came, strained with alarm. "Ma'am, 2 destroyers, decloaking off our port stern." They were hiding in the cruiser's drive shadow. Rostova's blood ran cold. The hunters had become the hunted. Plasma bolts, brilliant green lances of pure energy, erupted from the destroyers, scoring a direct hit on one of Rostova's ships, the T-Yish-Zin silent dagger. Its shields flared, held for a moment, and then collapsed under the sheer, overwhelming power. The plasma washed over the frigate's hull, and the small ship, with its crew of 64 souls, simply ceased to exist, its destruction a brief, silent nova in the cosmic gloom. Evasive maneuvers, Rostova yelled, as the Nyx herself was bracketed by enemy fire. "Get us into that asteroid cluster." Now the razor's edge had cut deep, but the beast had finally struck back. Rostova had drawn first blood, but now her own was being shed in the cold, dark graveyard of the Typhon's Veil. Her 48 hours had just begun, and the price of time was rising with every passing second. The loss of the silent dagger was a visceral shock, a sudden versus brutal punctuation mark in the silent ballet of the Veil. One moment, it was an icon on a tactical display, a sister ship full of comrades. The next, it was a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated gas. On the bridge of the Nyx, the grim reality of their mission settled in. They were not just buying time with steel and strategy, they were buying it with lives. Ava Rostova forced the image of the vaporized frigate from her mind, her grief a luxury she could not afford. The two Cathar destroyers that had ambushed them were now closing in, their plasma cannons glowing with malevolent green energy as they recharged for another salvo. "Jax, give me a solution," she snapped, her voice cutting through the tension. How did they see us? Lieutenant Jax's fingers flew across his console, his face pale in the monitor's glow. "They're not using standard scans. Ma'am, they're flooding the area with gravitic pulses and reading the echoes. Our cloaks can hide us from light and energy, but they can't hide our mass. It's crude. But in this debris field, anything with a clean, coherent mass stands out. They've adapted." Rostova's mind raced. Zilar was no fool. He had turned the very environment she had chosen against her. "Then we adapt faster," she declared. "Helm, take us into the thickest part of that wreckage field. I want our mass signature lost in the background noise of those planetoids. Comms, break radio silence. Encrypted burst to the rest of the wing. New protocol, hunt in pairs. One ship acts as a lure, making short, high-energy burns to draw their attention. The other stays cold and silent, waiting for the ambush. We used their new tactic against them. It was a desperate gamble. It meant splitting her already tiny force and deliberately exposing her ships to enemy fire. But staying together and fighting conventionally was suicide. They had to remain ghosts, even if it meant some of them became real ones. The Nyx plunged into a dense cluster of tumbling, iron-rich asteroids. The Cathar destroyers in hot pursuit. Plasma bolts seared the void around them, some impacting on the asteroids and sending molten slag flying through space. The ship shuddered as a near miss overloaded a section of the power grid, plunging half the bridge into a flickering emergency red. Just as the destroyers were about to get a clear firing solution, another Terran frigate, the Shade, decloaked on their flank. It wasn't there to fight. It fired a single, specialized missile. The warhead wasn't explosive, it was a gravitic projector. As it detonated, it created a massive, momentary gravity well that tugged violently at the two Cathar ships. Their hulls groaned under the unnatural strain, and their perfectly aligned plasma cannons were thrown off target. That was the opening the Nyx needed. Pivoting on its axis, it fired a full volley of kinetic slugs not at the destroyers' hulls, but at the asteroid directly in front of them. The mountain-sized rock, already weakened by stray plasma shots, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, creating a dense cloud of high-velocity shrapnel that slammed into the Cathar ships. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was crippling. Armor plating was shredded. Sensor arrays were sandblasted into uselessness, and one of the destroyers lost its primary weapon, battered and blinded. The two Cathar ships retreated, leaving the Nyx and the Shade to melt back into the shadows. They had survived, but the Veil was no longer a hunting ground. It was a knife fight in a dark room. For the next 30 hours, this brutal dance continued. Rostova's ships, now operating in pairs, bled the 9th Fleet with 1,000 small cuts. A Cathar cruiser would find its engines disabled. A destroyer would lose its shields to a well-placed gravitic mine. The Terrans were paying a heavy price. Another frigate, the Spectre, was lost when its lure mission went wrong, cornered and annihilated by 3 Cathar destroyers. But for every ship they lost, they disabled or crippled 3 of the enemies. They were a thorn in the side of the swarm, a persistent, painful irritation that Zelar could not ignore and could not easily remove. On the bridge of the carapace of worlds, Hive Marshal Zelar watched his fleet's steady advance slow to a crawl. His force was being whittled down not by a fleet, but by a handful of phantoms. The Terran tactics were infuriatingly effective, a blend of precision, sacrifice, and a deep, instinctual understanding of guerrilla warfare that his own rigidly disciplined mind struggled to counter. He had lost 5 ships, with another dozen heavily damaged and falling behind. It was an unacceptable rate of attrition. "They are fighting like cornered animals," his sub-commander observed. Fierce, but desperate. Swiler's mandibles clicked, a sound like cracking ice. "No," he corrected. "They are fighting like a parent defending its nest. There is a difference. A cornered animal flees if given the chance. These, they do not flee. They only bite, and bite, and bite." He looked at the veil, no longer a mere obstacle, but a symbol of the chaotic, illogical defiance that defined the human species. His desire to simply smash his way through was tempered by the cold reality of his losses. He had to end this. He made a decision that went against every tenet of Cathar military doctrine. He would split his force. "Sub-Commander, you will take command of the main fleet. Continue your advance through the veil at a reduced, cautious pace. Engage the phantoms if you must. But your primary objective is to exit the veil and proceed to the target system. Do not be drawn into their games." "And you?" Marshal the sub-commander asked. A cold, predatory light gleamed in Zylar's multifaceted eyes. "I am taking my flagship and my 4 most experienced destroyer crews. I am going to hunt the hunters. This chaotic battle has a mind behind it, a single commander directing the phantoms. I will find that mind, and I will crush it. Once the head of the serpent is severed, the body will wither." It was a bold, unprecedented move. A Hive Marshal, the embodiment of the collective, was detaching himself to engage in a personal vendetta. He was adapting, learning from his enemy, and in doing so, becoming something even more dangerous. Aboard the Steadfast, Admiral Vance watched the Battle of the Veil with a grim, helpless intensity. Every Terran loss was a dagger in his heart. Every crippled Cathar ship was a few more precious minutes bought for Earth. Reinforcements were streaming in from across the system, the scattered elements of the Ghost Fleet converging on Sol, but they were still hours away from being able to form a credible defense. Rostova and her handful of ships were all that stood in the way. Then his tactical officer spoke, his voice tight with alarm. "Sir, the Cathar fleet is splitting up. The main body continues its advance, but a smaller battle group, led by the flagship, has broken off. It's changing course." Vance watched as the icons shifted. The new course was not random. The smaller Cathar squadron was moving with a chilling precision, sweeping through the sector of the Veil where Strikewing Obsidian had been most active. "He knows," Vance whispered. "He's not just fighting the fleet anymore. He's hunting Eva." The warning reached the Nyx just moments before Gilar's trap was sprung. Rostova had been coordinating the defense, her mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. when the priority message from Vance arrived. At the same time, Jax shouted a warning. "Ma'am, multiple high-energy signatures decloaking all around us. It's the Cathar flagship and 4 destroyers they've boxed us in." Eva Rostova looked at her tactical display and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's life support. 5 Cathar warships, including a vessel 10 times the size of her own, had materialized from the void, forming a perfect cage around the Nyx and its partnership, the Revenant. They had been located. The hunt was over. A communication channel opened, unencrypted, broadcasting across all frequencies. It was a series of harsh, clicking sounds, but the universal translator rendered it into cold, clear text on her screen. "I am Hive Marshal Xealer. You are the mind behind this cowardly attack. Surrender your vessel now, and I will grant your crew a swift, clean death. Resist, and I will boil the atmosphere from your homeworld." Rostova looked at the message, then at the faces of her bridge crew. She saw fear, but she also saw defiance. They had come here to die, if necessary, but they would not die cowering. "Jax," she said, her voice steady. "Plot a firing solution. Target the flagship's bridge." Jax stared at her. "Ma'am, their shields could withstand a direct hit from a dreadnought. Our slugs won't even scratch them." "I am aware of that, Lieutenant," Rostova replied calmly. "Do it." She then opened her own channel, broadcasting in the clear. "This is Commander Eva Rostova of the Terran vessel Nyx. We have a message for the Hive Marshal." She paused, letting the silence hang in the void. "Go back to the hell you came from." Then, to her own crew, she gave her final order. Fire. The Nyx and the Revenant, 2 tiny ships against a giant and his honor guard, fired their kinetic cannons. The slugs streaked across the void and impacted harmlessly against the shimmering energy shields of the carapace of worlds, dissipating in tiny flashes of light. It was a gesture of pure, suicidal defiance, and it was exactly what Xealar had expected. "So be it." The translator flashed. The plasma cannons of 5 Cathar warships began to glow, promising an imminent, fiery end. Rostova closed her eyes, not in fear, but in a final, quiet acceptance of the price of freedom. The green fire of the Cathar plasma cannons bloomed in the void, a silent, beautiful promise of annihilation. On the bridge of the Nyx, time seemed to stretch, each microsecond a lifetime. Eva Rostova did not see the incoming energy bolts. She saw the faces of her crew reflected in her dark command screen, their features illuminated by the telltales of their imminent death. But in their eyes, she saw no panic, only a terrible, waiting resolve. In that final, fleeting moment, she felt not regret, but a profound and searing pride. They had held the line. They had not broken. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Jax's voice was unnaturally calm, a single point of focus in the coming storm. "The probes are in. We have the data." A new string of code scrolled across Rostova's screen. It was a complex waveform analysis of the carapace of world's shield harmonics. Her suicidal shot had not been a gesture. It had been a delivery system. The kinetic slugs had been sabots, their cores packed not with explosives, but with a swarm of microscopic, cloaked sensor probes. While the slugs had harmlessly disintegrated against the flagship's shields, the probes, shielded by the slug's kinetic energy, had slipped through in their wake, latching onto the hull. They had spent the last 30 seconds tasting the shield's energy, analyzing its frequencies, searching for a flaw. And they had found one. He's diverting massive amounts of power to his gravitic sensor sweeps. Jax reported, his words coming faster now. It's creating a fractional power lag in the shield refresh rate on the forward dorsal emitters. A flicker. Lasts less than a nanosecond, but it's there. It's a keyhole. Rostova's mind, honed by a lifetime of war games and desperate strategy, saw the path in an instant. It was not a path to victory, but to survival. Revenant. She broadcast on a tight beam channel to her last sister ship. This is Nyx. I have a plan. It will cost you everything. The reply from the Revenant's captain was immediate, his voice laced with gallows humor. We were getting bored anyway. Commander, send the plan. The data packet flew. The plasma bolts from the Cathar destroyers struck first. The Revenant, moving on Rostova's command, threw itself in front of the Nyx, its shields flaring into incandescent brilliance. They held for a full second, a heroic, impossible feat of engineering, before they shattered. The plasma washed over its hull, but instead of vaporizing, the Revenant's captain had executed one last defiant maneuver. He had vented his entire coolant supply, creating a temporary, super-dense cloud of crystalline particles that absorbed and diffracted the worst of the plasma's energy. The ship was a crippled, burning wreck, but it was still in one piece. It had bought the Nyx 2 seconds. Now Rostova commanded. The Nyx fired a single, precisely aimed kinetic slug at the flagship's dorsal shield emitter, the exact spot Jax had identified. At the same moment, the dying Revenant fired its entire remaining magazine of slugs, not at the enemy, but at a colossal, unstable asteroid of frozen methane just beyond the Cathar formation. The Nyx's slug struck the flagship's shield at the precise nanosecond of the refresh lag. The key had met the keyhole. The shield flickered, and the tungsten rod passed through, striking the emitter beneath. The shield didn't collapse, but a momentary hole had been torn in Azilar's perfect defense, and through that hole, he saw the Revenant's volley strike the methane asteroid. The resulting explosion was biblical. The asteroid detonated with the force of a small star, unleashing a shockwave of expanding gas and ice shards that slammed into the Cathar battle group. The flagship's remaining shields absorbed the blast, but the sheer concussive force sent the massive vessel reeling, its sensors blinded by the thermal and electromagnetic pulse. In that single, blinding moment of chaos, the Nyx did the impossible. Rostova engaged the ship's experimental skip drive, a volatile, short-range FTL system designed for last-ditch escapes. It didn't teleport the ship. It briefly shunted it into a pocket of distorted space-time. For a terrifying second, the Nyx seemed to dissolve, and then it was gone, having jumped directly through the heart of the expanding fireball, using the explosion's chaos to mask its escape. On the bridge of the carapace of worlds, alarms shrieked as systems fought to recover. Hive Marshal Zilar clung to his command dais, his mind struggling to process the sheer, illogical audacity of the Terran commander. She had used one of her ships as a shield, the other as a bomb, and had turned his own tactical superiority into a weapon against him. She had not just escaped, she had humiliated him. "Find her!" he roared. But there was nothing to find. The Nyx was a ghost once more. Lost in the veil, Zilar looked at the tactical display. The rest of his fleet was still struggling through the nebula. Harassed by the 2 remaining Terran frigates, his personal hunt had failed, and it had cost him precious time. With a rage that felt like grinding glass in his soul, he made the pragmatic choice. His vendetta was over. The mission remained. All forces. He broadcast to his battered fleet. Regroup. We are pushing through. Our destination is unchanged. The T sights. Nyx, scarred and bleeding energy, limped out of the Typhon's veil. Its crew was exhausted, haunted by the loss of their comrades. But they were alive, and they had succeeded. As they cleared the last of the nebular dust, the sight before them made every sacrifice worthwhile. Waiting in the silent, empty space before them was the assembled Ghost Fleet. Not 6 ships, or 30, but over 200. Sleek black cruisers, heavy destroyers, and at their center, the old, indomitable form of the T, Z, steadfast. They were a wall of silent, waiting steel, a shield forged in secret and tempered in defiance. When the Cathar 9th Fleet finally emerged from the veil, they were no longer a proud, unstoppable swarm. They were a battered, wounded pack, their numbers reduced by 1/3, their perfect formation broken. And they emerged to find themselves facing the full reunified might of the Terran Navy. On the bridge of his flagship, Hive Marshal Zelar stared at the impossible fleet arrayed against him. His sensors screamed warnings. The Terran ships were not the obsolete patrol craft his intelligence had reported. They were modern, powerful, and their weapon signatures were unlike anything in the hegemony's databases. He had been lied to. His entire species had been lied to for a century. A channel opened. It was Admiral Vance. The old man's face appeared on Zylar's main view screen, his eyes as cold and deep as the void itself. Hive Marshal Zylar. Vance's voice was calm, devoid of triumph. You came here to purge what you believe to be a pest. Instead, you have found a dragon, roused from its slumber. You have broken the compact. Terran. Zelar grated. The hegemony will crush you for this. Vance offered a slow, weary smile. There is no more hegemony. Not as you knew it. The silence we gave you was a seed, and in that silence, on a dozen worlds you oppressed, that seed has sprouted into rebellion, armed with our technology and fueled by your tyranny. Your empire is on fire. Marshal, you just haven't seen the smoke yet. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. So you have a choice. You can die here, in honorable battle against a foe you cannot possibly defeat. Or you can retreat. You can go home and bear witness. Tell your masters what humanity has become. Tell them that the age of the silent servant is over. Tell them the quiet war has ended. For the first time in his life, Zelar felt an emotion that was not rage, or pride, or loyalty. It was a cold, alien thing doubt. He looked at the fleet before him, at the silent cannons of the black warships. He looked back at the veil, the graveyard of his pride. He was a creature of logic and order, and the logic was undeniable. To fight was to die for nothing. To live was to carry a warning that could save his species from a wider, unwinnable war. Slowly, with a grating screech of protesting metal, the carapace of worlds turned. Its escorts followed suit. The 9th Extermination Fleet, the pride of the Cathar military, turned its back on Earth and began its long, humiliating journey home. The Battle of Sol was over aboard the Steadfast, A quiet cheer rippled through the bridge. Vance watched the crimson icons recede, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood Commander Eva Rustova, her arm in a medical brace, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes bright. "It's not over, is it, sir?" she asked quietly. Vance shook his head, his gaze drifting to the galactic map, which was now slowly beginning to light up with new, independent factions. "No, Commander. It's just the beginning. We traded our cage for a battlefield." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just a cold strategist, but the weary father of a reborn nation. But for the first time in 100 years, he said, a hint of a true smile touching his lips, "It's our battlefield." The silence had been their first weapon, but the thunder of their newfound freedom would be their last, an echo that would now reshape the stars.